Right.
Take one, interview with Lee. Ready?
Ready.
Can you tell me why Neil had such a fatal fascination with Cambodia?
Yes, well, there were many reasons, and they were all complex. Essentially, Cambodia was a marvelous country. It was physically beautiful. I think it's the most beautiful country I've ever been to. The people were marvelous, at least the people in the countryside, the people in the city, the people that weren't shooting at you, the communist soldiers. They were extremely friendly, they were gregarious, they were polite, they were so honest that when I was working for the Associated Press there, and I had my office and living quarters in the main hotel there, the Hotel Le Phnom, I used to sleep every night with a key in the door and the door fully wide open. And there was never a thing stolen out of there. And many times when I went into a restaurant and left my cameras behind, the waiters would come running after me, "Monsieur, monsieur, you've forgotten your cameras." They were non-acquisitive, they were extremely honest, they were just marvelous people to live with. And I think, as one American correspondent said, every foreign correspondent should fall in love with some country. And for Neil and for me and for people like Dennis Cameron and for a few others that lived in Cambodia for years, that was the country we fell in love with.
Can you explain why Neil has got this desire to go back into frontline combat, to be involved with that?
I can only speak for myself in that respect and maybe judge Neil by the same standards. Simply, he misses the excitement. And Neil was always out on the front lines that I remember for all the years that I lived in Cambodia and knew Neil. And Neil was always out on the front lines, shooting the action right in the middle of the combat with the soldiers, taking his chances like any soldier would, getting shot at, getting wounded several times. I think Neil's an old war horse and he misses the excitement.
And the final point, which was, what influence did Neil have upon you in terms of when you first arrived there and you met him? You'd been there a while, right?
Yes. Neil was sort of the rule stick by which you set your standards. And I think I and many other people wanted to be as much like Neil as possible. I was still new to Southeast Asia at that point, to Indochina. I'd only been in Vietnam for a year before I got to Cambodia. And Neil was flamboyant, and Neil was courageous and daring. And when you saw Neil in action, that's exactly what you wanted to do. You wanted to be just like Neil.
Great.
Okay, Marcus.
Take two, interview with Lee. When you're ready?
Camera's ready.
Lee, can you tell me why Neil stayed in Saigon?
Well, I think for most of us that were... Neil, of course, was in Phnom Penh. He was based in Cambodia before the fall of Saigon, before the fall of Cambodia. And I remember Saturday, the 11th of April of '75, that morning the U.S. Embassy was sending in helicopters into Phnom Penh to evacuate all the Americans from the embassy and a lot of Cambodians that wanted to go. At first they had set standards. You had to produce certain documents, credentials, identity, prove that you were entitled to go out if you were Cambodian. But it was such utter confusion, and it didn't help to have a rocket hit there near the embassy. The U.S. Marines were very nervous there. They jumped out of the helicopters with their M16s, trained on all these poor civilian Cambodians in the confusion of it all. So when they started evacuating all the civilians, Americans and other Europeans who'd stayed behind, a lot of us had made up our minds either to go out with the Americans. We knew that was going to be the last flight out. There were no civilian flights out of Cambodia at all at that point. We had all made decisions ahead of time, at least a week or so. We're going out with the Americans or we're staying behind. But when it came down to the crunch, there was so much confusion and there was so much emotional conflict. People had changes of mind at the last moment. People that wanted to go out decided to stay. People that wanted to stay panicked and left. All I know is that on the morning of that day that the Americans were coming to evacuate the embassy, Saturday morning. I had just finished breakfast at the hotel. This was 8 o'clock in the morning. And I walked across the lobby and I saw the American Consul General, Jack McCarthy, running up the stairs in an old shirt, an old pair of jeans, a revolver handle sticking out his back pocket. And I stopped McCarthy and I said, is this it, Jack? We're pulling out today, aren't we? Jack says, wait a minute, Lee, I can't tell you a thing at this moment. Stay in touch with the embassy. This was an hour before the actual evacuation. So I decided then, that morning, not to go. I decided to stay. And while I was in the lobby, McCarthy had just left, and Neil Davis comes charging through the lobby, comes hurrying through the lobby, and he grabs him and he says, Lee, he said, the Americans are evacuating today, this is it. What am I going to do, Lee? What shall I do? Well, what could I say? Every man makes his own decision and that kind of thing. So I said simply, well, I've decided to stay, Neil. I don't know. And that's the last I saw of Neil that day. That's the last I saw of Neil for a long time.
But he stayed in Saigon.
Neil went to Bangkok with the American helicopters, or he went out to sea where the ships were waiting, and then the ships took them all to Bangkok as a stopover. And while Neil was in Bangkok, I suppose he had second thoughts and decided he'd lost out on the last days of Cambodia. So at least he was going to be there for the last days of Saigon. So Neil flew into Saigon just before Saigon collapsed. And he got there just in time to be inside the presidential palace with his camera as the first NVA tanks rolled in through the gates.
Was there much risk in terms of staying there, you think? What the other correspondents, cameramen felt?
Yes, there were. Everybody had his own reason for staying. Some wanted to stay to do the final story, to finish the story. Some wanted to stay out of a sense of bravado. Some wanted to stay because they had obligations in Cambodia towards Cambodians and other people. Neil had no obligations, so I think he did the right thing in getting out. And then when he was in Bangkok and saw that we were still alive in Cambodia and things were still all right, he decided to go into Saigon, which was still at that point just before the North Vietnamese troops came in.
He said you left a lot of friends behind in Cambodia, Phnom Penh.
Yes, we all did. And Neil had very many because Neil had lived there for all 5 years since the war broke out, since 1970. And Neil was very popular. He had a lot of friends there.
Cut.
Okay.